Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar, brought to you by the Voicing Collegiate Recovery Project. My name is Tanya Nieri, and I am an associate professor in the sociology department at UC Riverside. A recording of this webinar will be available in about 1 or 2 weeks' time after the webinar at the website you see available on your screen. Feel free to pass on the information about the webinar to other people so they can listen to it in case they missed it today. So some logistics. As audience members, you are muted and unable to speak. However, we welcome your questions and comments. You can contribute your questions and comments by scrolling either to the bottom or the top of your screen. It varies by computer, and clicking on the question and answer button. Then a window will pop up like you see on the left of your screen, and you can type in your question and comment. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. For students listening in, we include information here about resources should you wish to access them. There are resources at the UCs as well as off campus. Also, again, listed on the left of your screen is the website for the recordings of the webinar after we conclude. We have additional events. You can check them out here and also go to our website and gather more information. For example, our next event is February 26th, which is a webinar that reviews the research on interventions for college students in recovery. Please join us. Now for today's agenda. I will introduce the presenters and we will hear their presentation. Then we'll have a question and answer session where audience members have an opportunity to comment and ask questions, and the presenters can respond. And then we'll conclude with this link to an email survey or an online survey where we will ask for your feedback on today's event and seek your suggestions for future events. Without further ado, let me introduce our presenters. We're very excited to have Lisa Laitman and Keith Murphy here today from Rutgers University. Lisa Laitman is director of the Alcohol and Other Drug Assistance Program, and Keith works very closely with Lisa. He's the senior recovery counselor at that particular program. We welcome them both today for their presentation on integrating collegiate recovery services with other campus services.
Okay, that's good. That's better. So we knew that you wouldn't be able to see us today, so we decided to add a picture. We didn't realize that our presenters were gonna also add some of our professional pictures. This was an event that we had that was a kind of a fun event. Next. So we're going to focus on 3 areas today. One is really to talk about the background for some collegiate recovery programs and talking about some of the ways that we evolved, as well as some other programs to be integrated systems of care, and also perhaps to touch on some of the different models with schools that don't quite have integrated systems of care. We were also going to focus on some of the development stages that most collegiate recovery programs and communities go through, and then talk about some of the impact of some current issues with dual CBD and medication-assisted treatment on collegiate recovery programs. Next. So the term abstinence hostile environment is something that we have adopted in a lot of our discussions about collegiate recovery programs, because it really puts our programs in context of the environment that they're often in. And the challenge of many of our collegiate recovery programs is making our campuses recovery-friendly environments, so that our students who are in recovery can find the support to pursue their college experience. Next. Some of the challenges of college students in recovery on campuses are really that at this age group, many of their college peers are starting or increasing their experimentation. Many of our students first time away from home And our students are often at a very different stage where they've been to treatment programs, they've already had a lot of experiences with using, and so they're sharing their environment with a very different group of people. So one of the challenges is really learning how is about how to maintain abstinence in an environment that has many other students who are involved in using. Now, we are going to talk more about abstinence in our presentation, but for the purposes right now, what we would like to say is that the collegiate recovery programs that we're talking about in this instance are where students have made a commitment to abstinence, and the collegiate recovery program is supporting that decision. And is also, we are in the, we are in sort of the business of creating a safe haven or a safe space for students on a college campus. We're going to get a little bit later to talking about different models and of this particular topic. But for now, we're going to use abstinence as a mainstay for the collegiate recovery program. So many of our students have already and are still in the process of restructuring their lives to avoid behaviors and triggers that may lead to use. They're learning how to balance the demands of recovery and academics, and they're making new friends and finding a place of belonging. Some of them have relocated, so they've left their support networks at home or in another state or in another location, and so they have to rebuild that. Next. So these are the areas that we've learned over time are pretty essential to collegiate recovery communities and programs. Obviously, the staying abstinent and working on sobriety are important parts, but so are other aspects. Having fun, being engaged in both sports, fun events, sober events are a really important part of the college experience. The idea that college students need to become engaged in the campus, and collegiate recovery programs offer a way for students in recovery to become engaged in a safe and fun way. We've learned through experience that having a full-time recovery counselor has been a tremendous asset. We went for many years with not having a person who's dedicated to developing the community and the program, and it became a very challenging thing as our program grew to not have a person whose role was to support the recovery program. We also learned about the importance for supporting mental health recovery for students who have co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. So these are the other areas that we'll hopefully get to touch upon in our presentation. Next. So for those of you who are considering recovery housing or who have recovery housing, we have now 32 years of experience with running on-campus housing for students in recovery. And many people have talked to us about their efforts to develop recovery housing. So I think we'll just take a couple of minutes now and go through some of the essential sort of ingredients to making this work. And I have to say that putting students at the top is a very important part of this. We had a collegiate recovery program for 5 years before we started recovery housing. So we had students who met who who got to know each other. We had meetings on campus that they helped start. And even and at that early time in our development, we realized the importance of that peer support. And the students themselves were motivated because they wanted to have more friends on campus who were in recovery. And so what we also learned is that many of those students in the beginning, they all did not want to live on campus in the recovery house. So we had to have a fairly sizable community of students before we had enough students who wanted to live on campus to make that viable. We also had to sell administration on the idea. Institutional denial is always there. It may be less now than it is in the past, although I think it just changes over time. I think we still struggle with stigma on campus. But I think that campuses that have already made commitments to special interest housing or living learning communities are a little bit ahead of the curve in understanding the needs of unique student communities. So I think we have a little bit more buy-in on some of those campuses. So I think we also realize how important it is to have students who've expressed an interest and are willing to support recovery housing. In many schools, in many areas, students in recovery live together off campus, and that's a good model. It works in a lot of areas. In our community, we have, we're a large Northeastern university. It's very expensive to live anywhere, so that we found that offering on-campus housing not only made things a lot more accessible to our students, but it also bypassed some of the problems that our students have finding adequate, comfortable off-campus housing. So that was one of the reasons that in our area we found this to be the best option.
May I jump in really fast?
Sure.
And please note that on the slide it says students engaged in your CRP, not just recovery students, because allies are very, very key, or students who are aligned with the recovery movement are absolutely essential in keeping the community together and helping the students bridge the gap between students who are in recovery and students who aren't in recovery. So I just want to make mention of that's intentional, that it just says students.
Mm-hmm. And I can't say enough about supportive colleagues, administrators, faculty, staff. Some schools have an advisory board that creates some of that support. Here at Rutgers, we've always had a core group of people who have spoken up or have supported us when we needed them. Next. So in terms of talking about what it takes to sustain a program, a community of recovery, again, these are experiences that we've had over the years that have helped us continue to build. It's vital that you have clinicians who are trained not only as substance abuse counselors, but are people who have experience with addiction and recovery. And I also want to add, having staff who have lived experience is also pretty vital in sustaining a community of recovery. I also can speak a lot for having multidisciplinary teams for people, different types of clinicians who can help with co-occurring disorders. And in our environment, we work as part of the counseling center, which is integrated with health centers. We have colleagues who have, through the experience of working with us, gained a lot of knowledge and experience working with students in recovery. so that when they have someone who's in recovery in a dialectical behavior therapy group, they know how to address some of the issues that come up in any of our clinical services. We also work closely with psychiatrists in our counseling centers who also have developed expertise in working with students in recovery, from not prescribing medications that may be harmful to also understanding some of the acute and longer term needs for students in recovery to manage mental health problems. And acknowledging that some of our students have co-occurring mental health disorders is also critical to their overall well-being in recovery. So we focus on the whole person in our community. We try to destigmatize not just substance use disorders, but also mental health disorders in our effort to really engage people in healthy living. And we have learned, probably the hard way, to not make the accountability and leadership all come from the staff or from the top. Our process is really building community accountability and leadership in our student population, and Keith is going to talk a lot more about that. Next. So the idea of integrated care is complicated on a college campus. In the literature, integrated care is an evidence-based model for addressing substance use disorders. It's not really questioned, although I have to tell you that in my experience, I haven't seen a lot of really good integrated care models yet. I think we're all working toward improving on this, and it is actually one of my commitments here at our university, is really working toward a better model of integrated care. But it really supports, ultimately, it really supports both our students who are in recovery and those who are in need of recovery when our systems work together. So we're talking often about counseling services, health services, collegiate recovery programs, and community resources, because our community resources are part of that community continuum. Because many of our students have been involved with community resources, and making a smooth transition into our universities, colleges, and community colleges requires our community resources to work closely with us, to understand our admission criteria, to understand when students are ready for college or campus, and then to try to provide some of the bridge services for our students. Some of the problems with on college campuses are also often that our services are siloed. A lot of times they're siloed because of ancient history. And a lot of people don't even know why they're siloed anymore, but they are. And sometimes it really takes a new person on the block, perhaps a collegiate recovery coordinator, to challenge some of the silos and to build these communities and connections with different services that have typically not worked together. For that, we often need a lot of support. And I see that happening more and more on the Association of Recovery and Higher Education chat thing that we have.
The listserv.
The listserv, thank you, Keith. And I think that more and more we're turning to each other to help solve these problems that many of us have done over the years, and without any support. And I'm glad that more of us are providing that kind of technical assistance for each other. Next. So I'm going to turn it over to Keith, and the idea of how we were working together today is that we're going to sort of move back and forth as we need to, but I'm just going to turn it over to Keith Murphy at this point.
Thank you, Lisa. There's a lot of good information there. The process of creating a healthy collegiate recovery program, and it's interesting, Lisa, that you mentioned before that students were meeting before collegiate recovery even had a name. So they were just together on the idea of bonding together and identifying. So the first part of it in a collegiate recovery program is having students who want and support to develop a CRP and to keep it going. Because without students, it doesn't happen. We could have all the best intentions in the world, but it doesn't quite work. The next thing clearly is staff administrative oversight. And the thing that I go to is rules without relationship lead to rebellion. Meaning it's key to have someone that's consistent and reliable and have staff on many levels who understand what it means, understands one, student development, the challenges students would face, and what are the issues specific to students that are in recovery. Those things are absolutely key in having staff oversight and developing a program and how they set up boundaries and parameters for students, one, to feel safe, because part of an addictive lifestyle is chaos. And one of the things that we're trying to promote and keep and sustain is a safe place for students to grow and explore and do different things in their recovery. The next thing, obviously, is program infrastructure. And that infrastructure for me is just basic, clear policies that everyone can follow. And not that they're not flexible or rigid, but they're flexible and that they follow general principles, but people can understand them so that they can walk around and not be confused. And it's easy for them to flow in and out of the program because we don't want to hinder their own group. And that's also key in terms of their treatment too, as well, when you're doing a CRP, because students want to know what they're getting themselves into. And it also helps to set up parameters to develop healthy and safe relationships. And again, CRP mission and values, those mission and value statements should also coincide with the large university. You know, are you really for students in recovery? Do you understand the process of students, how they grow and how they change in collegiate recovery programs? And then also understanding your mission and vision statements should stick regardless of the circumstance or the situation. It should be something that can last through different administrations, turnover with different students. It's something that it's almost foundational. And then the last part of creating a healthy CRP, and what's really not said is a lot of hard work. And I go back to, you know, really it's about developing really, really consistent and good relationships with not only parents, but school administrators, community people, other stakeholders in the community. And that may mean people in residence life, that may mean people in the athletics department, that may mean people in dining services. That means having relationships with people all over the universe, all over the university in terms of collegiate recovery. Next.
And I also just want to add to that there are going to be years that are going to be much better than others. And just because you have a hard year or a hard couple of years doesn't mean your program is not going to work. And I think that over time, the university will start to learn how to help you manage that. But initially, you may need to, you know, utilize some of the lessons that other schools have learned so that people don't get discouraged by that.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. And helping the university to lean into some of the difficult pieces and showing them that they can tolerate it. All the different changes that students go through and changes with staff as well. This is absolutely key because I tend to believe in a servant leadership model, or the idea that one, especially with leadership coming from students, because you have to respect them as adults and people who have brains that can think too, because honestly, they're thinking about the program when I'm not thinking about the program or when we're not thinking about the program, because they live it on a day-to-day basis. They're always engaged with relationships and how they can improve things. And there's an African proverb that says, if you don't build a fire for someone in your village, they're going to figure out a way to burn it down and get heat by the fire that they built. Meaning, if you don't build a space for a student to really feel important and valued, right, what they're going to do is do everything in their power to tear down that program. So I believe firmly in empowering each student to understand what it means to be a part of the community, the collegiate recovery community, but the larger community. So some of the things that we talk about is also a need to build a healthy community. And what does that mean? And that means having consistent values and consistent understanding so everyone is moving generally in the same direction. What does it mean to be well? What does it mean to be recovered? Those things are clearly laid out. And I really want to be clear here is that it's important for us to focus on the idea of recovery, not just wellness in general, because I think it kind of gets sucked into this whole idea of a wellness community. We need to understand that we're focusing in on specifically the issues that are associated with students that are in recovery from substance use, severe substance use disorders. And oftentimes what's healthy for one group of students, that may include a whole bunch of things that may not work for our students. Then the other idea here is like, what values do we need to promote in our communities? What things do we elevate or spotlight? What other things that we kind of don't put as much emphasis on? And again, that changes with each student group that comes through, because each group has a different set of needs. And again, although our values and our mission statement may be the same and consistent, understanding the overall needs of the community may vary from, honestly, it could vary from week to week and day to day, month to month. And part of that is us learning how to be flexible. And that also means imparting certain students to also be leaders and become more vocal, because part of being in active addiction is silence and secrets. Next. Hiring and leadership to support our values. This is key. The first thing I'll lead with here is, and Lisa really pointed it out before, and I think this is absolutely key, is hiring someone with lived experience. Why is that important? It is important, one, for that person to be a model for the students, and it also demonstrates, that one, someone in recovery is doing something and they're out about their recovery status, meaning they're not afraid of the stigma. They're willing to be that person to kind of stand on the front lines and say, hey, I can be out about who I am, you can be out about who you are, and on some level, not be afraid of the consequences. Because oftentimes, students are really, really reluctant or afraid to really put themselves out there. But if they know that there's someone who's got like more experience, 10, 15 more years of actively living their recovery and being out and being an advocate, they're more inclined to talk to people about their recovery identity. That in turn that builds their confidence. One, it also helps them to separate who's really for them and who's really against them, and who's really going to support them in terms of like making healthy and good decisions. And plus, it also helps keep them accountable, because the longer and the more they talk about it, the more and more people know and expect, hey, this person's in recovery, let me not offer them a drink. Or when I see something that's off about them, be like, hey, I thought you were a person in recovery. So it kind of puts them more in the spotlight. So having a person that's a leadership person who's out about their recovery sets a model for them, and it's a reliable example, and it's a consistent individual. Well, that's the first part of being also considering and hiring. The other part, and this is something that I truly believe in, is showing equity, diversity, and justice and representation, not just in hiring, but also in bringing in students. One, we need to understand that our students in recovery, their identities and their process is not a stagnant thing. They evolve and they change, and sometimes they grow in and begin to understand their own sexuality, their own orientation about who they are, their own gender, who they are in terms of their own ethnicity, their own nationality, their own race. So it's the idea of having people that one can speak about those things fluently and easily without them feeling ashamed will also help them recover. Because we just don't deal with one identity. We deal with, and I can't emphasize this enough, we deal with a whole person. It's not just one person that's in recovery, that one identity. There's so many different intersections that a person walks into our recovery space with that we are learning to work with and try and help them grow and explore and understand. So it's important to have people who are versed in understanding like what are things that are going on in terms of equity, justice, and diversity. And truth be told, most students really look for someone like them, one, to emulate, and two, to show that like, hey, that they can have this a full and rich life as a person in recovery.
So just add a couple of things to this quickly, because many of you have different models of programs, and actually our model here is that we're embedded in the counseling center, and we offer services to students who are not in recovery at this time. We actually do a lot of work, harm reduction work with students, and so. But I also want to mention that because the staff we hire have to be fairly versatile. And so even our recovery counselor position is a position that where you have academic credentials, you've been well trained, and that this is an environment, and an academic environment, those are the things that are respected by colleagues. And so over the years, have learned the importance of having all of these things, which only makes it more complicated. Yeah.
Next slide. Thank you, Lisa. Reducing stigma encourages, and I'm going to change that, encourages help-seeking behavior. Reducing stigma saves lives. We have to understand that stigma is not discrimination. It's a said and unsaid policy and culture that values some people over another, and that leaves certain people out. So stigma is something that stops students from getting the help that they need. And one, it also keeps them in the shadows. And I believe Collegiate Recovery has an opportunity to help change the overall campus culture, so that students who may not even identify as needing recovery, but they're not sure about seeking help, one can see that, hey, students in recovery aren't afraid to get the help that they need, or there's a culture on campus that promotes health and recovery, so why don't I just get the help while I can now? And one of the things that I often think about too, especially with this age group, is that one, they don't think about what their problems are going to look like 10 years out from now. So when we do our job in reducing the stigma, what we're doing is changing the culture, not only changing the culture, but also giving students a chance at a future life. And that's really big. So that goes back to, how do we encourage that? One of the things that we do here at Rutgers, and students do, thankfully, is that they go out on speaking engagements. We talk about collegiate recovery on campus. We give opportunities in classes where we talk to health and outreach prevention workers on recovery. We talk about what does it mean to be a person in recovery. We speak in classrooms, we do presentations, but all of that is with the purpose of reducing stigma, because our students know, and as we know as professionals, that like, if students don't get the help that they need, and they don't feel as though they feel safe enough to get the help that they need, even though they may need it, it could end up hurting them in the long run. And not only just costing them their college career, but also their life, and doing greater harm or greater damage. Next slide. Yeah, this is, okay.
So we've got some complicated topics that we know are in the conversations of many people in collegiate recovery programs. So marijuana, cannabis, is something that has created some confusion for many students on our campuses. For a collegiate recovery program that has clear abstinence as a goal for their collegiate recovery program, this part is not so complicated. I think it becomes more complicated when we have new students coming in who are acknowledging a problem with alcohol, or a problem with oxycodone or other opiates, but see cannabis as not so bad, or a way that they've utilized to help them reduce use of other substances. And so we as a community have to have a way to talk about cannabis, even when the laws in the state that we're in, even when the environment doesn't always support those messages. And have a very clear message for our students who are in collegiate recovery programs. And perhaps recognize that some of them struggle with some of these messages more than they might with, opiates or alcohol, which aren't quite so muddled by our current environments. I've also run across issues with colleagues who also may not realize some of the research and some of the sort of serious issues involved with cannabis use disorders, and maybe giving our students mixed messages inadvertently. So one of the commitments that we've made is to do regular training and to bring in people who have expertise in this area in order to make sure that our staff stay current. Vaping, Juul, and other alternative nicotine delivery methods have infiltrated our collegiate recovery programs. And, we are currently, this is kind of a current issue we are dealing with in our residence halls in general. They're not allowed as well as any other nicotine method, but it's much harder to enforce. And many people have kind of thrown their hands up a little bit in trying to enforce this. And we are still struggling with this. We've tried to find evidence-based treatments for addressing these new types of nicotine delivery methods. And we've tried to encourage our community to look more carefully at this problem. Do you want to add?
Yeah, may I add too? More often than not, our students switch to vaping, but still maintain a habit of smoking on occasion. So it's not like they ever give up cigarette smoking entirely and go straight to vaping solely. They toggle back and forth depending on how much money they have and how much they get access to the vape juice, or if their vapes are broken. So for me to say oftentimes that vaping it's harm reduction, but it's really not breaking the students' need to have nicotine in their lives. So it's still on some level a life controlling issue. And they know it. And it's hard for them, and they'll admit it, that it's hard to break the use of nicotine products.
Mm-hmm. So our more recent experience with things like CBDs and herbal supplements has really been helped by the community, the recovery community, so that we're not, Keith and I and other staff are not the only ones talking about the potential harm of this. And actually the second part of the sentence, as there is little reliable scientific information on these products, is kind of a key part of the sentence, because I think in the absence of having adequate information, I think it's a pretty dicey thing for our students to start engaging in using these type of products.
And may I add to this, goes back to policies that are clear and not just based on how we feel at the moment, but they're also evidence-based policies too, and they're based on also many years of experience. So in terms of students using CBD oil, or the idea of us moving and having an abstinence-based situation or structure, that's absolutely key, because we know, and our students know, that any waffling in that opens up a lot of doors that they're not prepared to close. And also they want consistency. They want things that are absolutely clear, like this is an abstinence-based program where I feel safe to really explore my recovery. And I don't have to worry about feeling triggered because I'm questioning as to whether or not someone misused or overused some type of CBD or cannabis or type of THC. They're not guessing at who they can trust and who's not reliable.
Mm-hmm. And one more issue regarding these things is we have a history promoting a new pharmaceutical product as being safe, as being non-addictive. For those of you who heard some of this history, Valium was initially marketed as a cure for addiction. And opiates were originally marketed, prescription opiates, as being non-addictive and safe. So I think that those are really good examples of us sort of moving carefully into these arenas, especially for people who have worked so hard, and there's a life and death element to it. Next slide.
Okay. It seems though we're up against the time, but just to really answer this question really simply, what's the message about collegiate recovery programs and the opioid epidemic is, well, basically for me, it's just one, understanding. Honestly, we're in an addiction crisis. That's just bottom line. So for me to throw the label up, the opioid epidemic is true, but again, alcohol is still a #1 offender. Crystal meth is taking a rise. So I think we need to be vigilant here and be consistent in our programming and go on evidence-based work in terms of providing care to the students that come on campus and doing stuff that's consistent with science and what our principles are. You know, we're going to be in this, I think, for a little bit longer. God only knows, and I hope and pray that it's not much longer. But what we're doing is offering students a space to really recover in a good way. I mean, I don't know, Lisa, do you have any more that you want to add to it?
I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. Next. Next. Okay. I mean, part of reducing stigma is language. And the reason I'm going fast is because we're definitely up against time. But language is absolutely key. And to Lisa's point earlier, I've heard colleagues talk about students as potheads, you know, and that really increases stigma and keeps students away. And it's the idea of labeling. And it moves away from person-first language. And we want to remember that we're dealing with human beings. And I can't say it enough that people in recovery, especially early recovery, often get short shrift. And they get treated like, you know, like they don't have a voice or they don't have a brain. People in recovery or people who are in remission from substance use disorders have a brain. They can think and they can give great input about their care. So when we use language that demeans them as people or chronic or a substance abuser, it kind of puts them and makes them objects. And our goal is to help them and restore them as people to be cared about, and also one, to promote a culture of health and well-being on our campus. But as long as we keep throwing labels on people, they're not going to want to seek help. As long as you call them a pothead or somebody who's a chronic relapser, like who wants to be thought of as a chronic relapser? So we're very mindful of the language that we use. Next. Understanding recovery in the collegiate recovery program. I'll skip the first one in different forms. I'll go right to medication-assisted treatment in collegiate recovery programs. There's a space and a place for, they call it psychopharmaceutic, medication-assisted treatment in collegiate recovery programs. I am for it. However, what has to happen is we need structure and infrastructure in place to help students who are on MAT, one, feel supported, feel as though they're getting regulated doses of medication, and feel like they're not being stigmatized because they've found another pathway to recovery. Now, that may mean a lot of different things. That may mean Vivitrol, that may mean Suboxone for some folks, but part of it is for us to have staff that's trained and also having physicians and psychiatrists who are trained in the course of addiction and what recovery can look like for someone who's on medication-assisted treatment. And it's an ongoing conversation because also, ultimately, we don't live in that space or we don't utilize that space with students in recovery. What does it mean for them? What does it look like? What does it mean in terms of changing policies? What does it mean in terms of having behavioral contracts? how do students talk about and share with others that they're using certain medications to help them through their recovery? So those are, and then also in terms of safety, what if a student misuses their medication? What does that mean for maybe staff that are on duty or for other students who are in leadership positions? So for us to say that it's a pretty cut and dry conversation or thing, it really isn't, because it's very, very complex, and it's going to take a lot of conversation. And I think it's fair to say, and I've said this before, once you've seen one CRP, you've seen one CRP. So it can't be a one size fits all. But I will let you know, for most spaces, especially in a living space, I would be really cautious with certain types of medication for people that are in recovery.
So I did want to spend at least 2 minutes, and then we'll move into questions on the first topic, because I think that both Keith and I are really committed to the continuum of care and understanding the stages of change that people go through. We have large numbers of students on our college campuses who would benefit from people who understand recovery and who understand addiction. And one of the things that I always really appreciate is when I'm working with someone who is trying to start addressing their use of substances, I'm always glad to be able to say to those students, we have a community of students on our campus who are abstinent, who do not use substances any longer, who do well academically, and who have a lot of fun, because that counteracts the social norm that the only way to have fun at college is to drink and use drugs. And on our campus for several decades now, we've had a much broader social norm. So we're going to move into questions and hopefully be able to answer some of the things that those of you in the audience have concerns about.
Okay, thank you to our presenters. I will read out some questions. Just give me a second here. Okay, thank you again to our presenters. All right, so the first question is, what is the ratio in your program of staff to students?
So that's a bit of a complicated question, because I think, as you heard, the Alcohol and Other Drug Assistance Program is not only a collegiate recovery program. So there are 4 full-time staff, but we do early intervention and we do regular substance counseling, and we also help people get into recovery and refer to treatment, and we do aftercare, and then we also do recovery support. So our community at Rutgers, we have 44,000 students on our campus, and we have 4 full-time substance use counselors. We are very busy. Our recovery community, the Recovery House has room for 40 students. While Keith is the full-time recovery counselor for the community, the other 3 counselors in the ADAP program also help support the students who are in the recovery program.
And also bear in mind that that the recovery community is larger than the students that actually live in the recovery house. So there's a lot more. Maybe you could even double the number, at least double the number of students that are in a recovery house at current, with active students that I know about that are in recovery that are on campus. And it's a really big school, so I don't know everybody on campus.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how can you increase the sense of accountability among students in recovery, especially those living together in sober housing? Also, how do you present the rules to a collegiate recovery community? Should collegiate recovery communities have full-time staff? And if so, how can students begin the process for finding full-time staff?
Wow, that's a lot.
Like
Okay, so we actually have a set of guidelines for the students who live in the recovery house. We would be willing to share them with anyone. We've pretty much, over the years expanded or changed or altered some of the rules, but they stay pretty consistent. We talk about relapse. We talk about what are the ways that you help one of your friends in the recovery house if they're struggling. So we also, talk about academics, and we make sure that people know how to access the help that exists on our campus. We really we have learned a lot of lessons the hard way. We used to focus a lot more on staff, having students follow the rules. We learned that doesn't work very well, and so the model that Keith has been really emphasizing, which is more of a community accountability model, is one that we've evolved to. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, understand the first part of it is culture and the students. Students, when they come into the recovery house, they want people to do well, and they know the pain of active addiction. So one of the things that's built in and baked in is that they want everyone to succeed. So it's the idea of like, what do we do to help everyone feel better or feel included and a part of? That's already there. So what we try and do is, or at least build on that idea, is that, and what makes it different is that we try and build a culture that's a collective culture. A lot of addiction and a lot of life is an individualistic culture, which goes against a lot of the principles of recovery. So it's the idea of getting everyone to think that like we're all in this together. And the guidelines, they're really not rocket science. The guidelines they're almost kindergarten in nature. Hands to yourself, feet on the floor, basic stuff. Don't use in this space. Be kind to each other. All of that stuff is written in, but it's the understanding that each student feels, one, that they've got access to staff, two, that the idea is not they're not telling on someone, it's the idea of trying to save someone's life, and it's the idea that, one, this community doesn't flourish or function without their input or without them being a part of what's happening. They're vital to what's going on, and that's what I try and promote, or that's what we try and talk about.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge that everybody is different. Like, there are students in the recovery house who are very quiet, who are not there to have a good time. They're there to get good grades and graduate. And then there are students who are really quite social and outgoing, and they struggle academically. And in some respect, having both of those people graduate and have increased the likelihood that they will stay sober throughout their life, and they've built on what they both have strengths in, is a success. Mm-hmm. But everybody is different, and not everybody is going to be in a community in the same way.
One question is whether or not the services are available to graduate students. And another question is, how do you support students who aren't in recovery from opioid use disorder?
We do have graduate students and undergraduates in our community, and it makes for a very nice mix of students. The numbers vary, but more and more we are having more graduate students, and more graduate students who want to live in the recovery house, actually. The second question is more complicated, I think. I think maybe you're referring to people who are on medication-assisted treatment but don't embrace traditional identities in recovery. I think we provide those students with therapy, with counseling, with other support services. All of our students have access to our group therapy program at the counseling center. So sometimes people have had significant issues with trauma. Some people have problems with emotional regulation. And so even if someone does not consider themselves in traditional recovery, we do provide a lot of support services. And we do see people get better in non-traditional ways.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for a few more questions here. There was a strong relationship between substance use disorder and justice involvement. Sure, there is a strong relationship between substance use disorder and justice involvement. How do you see collegiate recovery programs as a criminal justice intervention, both early in the court process or for individuals coming out of prison or jail?
Well, I'll make it, for me, really, really simple. One, a college degree is a protective factor in recidivism. Two, and then three, the other part of it is collegiate recovery is a great place for people who are formerly incarcerated who identify as being in recovery, right? And that may mean something different to different folks, but who want to embrace recovery, to feel supportive, to also demonstrate their commitment to their own recovery and even abstinence-based recovery, because it helps them in front of the court, it helps them with their family, it helps them to make amends to society, to right their wrongs, and it also puts them in a stronger position, and I'll say this, to build a future. And the idea, and ironically, the farther you go in college or with an advanced degree, the less, believe it or not, the less, what's the word I'm looking for? The less
Likely you are.
Well, the less likely you are to return, but also the less scrutiny you'll be under. And I'll explain. It's harder for me. I'll be more inclined to have a harder time getting a job if I just have my GED and I'm coming out of jail. But if I'm coming out of jail with my master's, people are going to be more, or if I get my master's or my bachelor's, people are going to be more inclined to give me a chance, because I've shown that what happened in my past was my past, and I'm actually dedicated to moving my life forward. So people can look past those things and be like, oh, why do you have a resume gap? Oh, but you've got a college degree. I see, well, tell me more about what's going on. And we have the privilege of working here on campus with men and people, not men only, but people who are formerly incarcerated, and some people associated with drug court who've been able to demonstrate that living in the recovery house has been super beneficial for them, and shown the court that, one, they're quote unquote rehabilitated, and two, that they're low risk. And that's also key. You know, the thing that I always say for someone who's involved in the justice system is to be low-hanging fruit. That means be accessible and be available. And college, one, is a regulated, it's structured, it's someplace where they know that they're going to be, and more often than not, someone who's coming out of jail has already worked out the issues, or prison has worked out the issues that may impact someone who's just coming into college. Their identity as a person is pretty much formed. And if they're going to college and if they're that motivated, collegiate recovery can only support that even more. So I rambled, but that's my answer.
Okay, great. We've got time for one last question here. And this question is, what would you recommend to coordinators and graduate assistants at recently founded collegiate recovery programs for reaching out to coordinators and staff at more established programs? Are there any helpful questions you would recommend asking for good ideas and encouragement in the first few years of a program?
So let me just put a plug in for the Association for Recovery in Higher Education. We have an annual conference. It's in the summer, and I would encourage anyone who's, especially people who are just starting collegiate recovery programs, to come to this conference, because there's a lot of people with experience there who would be more than willing to share their experiences. There's a lot of sessions where these questions can be asked, and then developing contacts of people who you can call on a regular basis. We're all here. I mean, I've been, as long as I've been at Rutgers, which is over 35 years, I've always been willing to answer questions from people who are starting programs. And I think that's very true for many of us in collegiate recovery.
And I'll add to this is saying small victories are key. Meaning don't start with anything super big. Do things as small as possible, and don't try and control things that are totally out of your control. Meaning, like, next year, don't make a goal and say, we're going to have 15 students that are in our recovery program. You're destined for failure. Just do things that you know that you can control. Like if it's a tabling thing, you want to table at 3 events, make that the goal. Oftentimes people come in with the idea of having super lofty ideas of like, oh, we're going to build and have a dorm on campus, and then we're going to, from that dorm, people are going to beat down the doors. I'm like, no. Do small events that give you the sense and satisfaction that you've had victories. Because if you start big and you fail big, you're going to feel disempowered from the very beginning, and you're not going to want to continue. So you want to build on what you can. That's what I'd say. So small victories are the key.
Thank you so much to our presenters for their excellent presentation, and thank you to our audience members for joining us and sharing their comments and questions. You can see on your screens a web address. We invite you to share your feedback on today's event and suggestions for future events. In conclusion, we thank you for being part of this event.